So in today's lesson, we're going to be looking at the concept of procedural justice. So I should say lecture 3 there. We're first going to look at the distinction between substantive and procedural justice as two different types of justice that we might be concerned about. Then we're going to look at the idea of public participation as one way that procedural justice has often been pursued. We're going to look at some of the different forms that participation might take, and we're going to wrap up by talking about the question of intent in justice and injustice. So to start off, we have a distinction that we can make between substance and procedure. So to think about this, we can imagine justice as making evaluations about decisions that we make about various courses of action. Should we do X or should we do Y? Doing X is just, doing Y is unjust, or vice versa. So substantive justice is the question of, is the outcome just? Did we pick the right choice out of all of the ones open to us? Right? Is X the right choice to have made? Is it more just than having chosen Y? Procedural justice asks whether the process for choosing was just or not. So did we use the right process for deciding which substantive outcome we were going to choose? And it's important to look at this distinction because a just procedure can be important independent of the substantive outcome. You can have a situation where the right outcome was chosen, but a wrong procedure was used, and there's still injustice in using the wrong procedure even if you got the right outcome. And vice versa. You can have a situation where the procedure was just even though the outcome that was selected was an unjust outcome. And so that's still better than if you had an unjust procedure and an unjust outcome. So the justice of the procedure can be important independent of the justice of the substantive outcome, but at the same time, having a just procedure can confer justice on the outcome. Sometimes you can't tell whether an outcome was just or not without knowing about the procedure that led to it. And so that's very clear in situations where consent might be important. Knowing whether or not the people affected consented to something can make the difference of whether that outcome is just or unjust. But the giving of consent is part of the procedure of making that decision. So we want to be able to distinguish when we're talking about substantive justice and when we're talking about procedural justice, and to be able to evaluate the distinctive aspects of each of those. So here's an example of making that substance versus procedure distinction if we look at the 2016 US presidential election. So for this election, there were essentially two different possible substantive outcomes, right? Two different things that could happen to the country as a result of that election. Either Donald Trump wins the election and gets to be president for the next 4 years, or Hillary Clinton wins the election and gets to be president for the next 4 years. Right? Those are very different substantive outcomes. Trump and Clinton would implement very different sorts of policies as president. So the substantive question is, would Donald Trump be a better president, or would Hillary Clinton be a better president? Okay? So we can make a substantive evaluation of whether the outcome in which Trump won the election was more just or less just than an outcome where Clinton won the election. Right? That's the substantive question, is who should be president. We also have a procedural question. How should we pick the president? And there's, of course, 1,000 different ways that you might pick a president, but there were two main procedures that people were advocating in that election. So some people thought that we should pick the president using the Electoral College system. Of course, that was the system that actually was used in that election. So some people think that's the right system, that it's just to pick our president using the Electoral College. Other people argued that it would be more just to use the popular vote, that the Electoral College is unjust, and so we should use a strict popular vote type of procedure to choose our president. in most presidential elections, the choice between those procedures wouldn't have made a difference in who actually won the election and became president. But I'm talking about 2016 rather than 2020, that's more recent, because this was a case in which the procedure did seem to make the difference in the substantive outcome. And so the actual outcome of that election was that we used the Electoral College and Donald Trump won and became president. But if you add up the popular vote, Hillary Clinton got more popular votes. And so it's, likely that if we had run the election on a popular vote system, that Hillary Clinton would have won and become president. So in this case, we have different procedures that might have led to different substantive outcomes. And so if your views of justice fall into one of the boxes that have got the little X's in, you're in kind of an easy situation. Right? If you believe the Electoral College is the right way to pick the president and you wanted Trump to be president, then it's very easy to hold those two views at the same time because the procedure that you like got you the result that you like. And likewise, if you think that the popular vote is the just way to choose a president and you wanted Hillary Clinton to be president, then again, those are very easily consistent with each other because if we use the popular vote, then Clinton probably would have won the election. It gets a little trickier if you're in one of the other two boxes. But those are possible positions someone could hold. Someone could be an advocate of the Electoral College. They could believe the Electoral College is the correct way to choose a president, but also have hoped that Hillary Clinton would have won the Electoral College. And likewise, you could believe that the popular vote is the right way to choose the president and have wanted Donald Trump to become president. So you can hold those other two combinations of substantive and procedural views. It just gets a little more complicated, right? And you have to decide whether getting the result that you want would be worth sacrificing the procedure that you would prefer or vice versa. Would you be willing as a Donald Trump supporting popular vote advocate to switch to a popular vote system even if that meant that Trump wouldn't have won the presidency? So that hopefully illustrates the distinction between substantive justice, the question in this case of who gets to be president, and procedure, the question of how do we choose the president. So a lot of times when we're talking about procedural justice, we're often talking about how much public participation should there be in making decisions about things that affect the environment. So public participation involves getting involvement from a wide set of stakeholders. So a stakeholder is anyone that would be affected by the outcome of that decision. So of course, in the case of the presidential election, everyone living in the country is a stakeholder because everyone stands to be affected by who gets to be president. For other sorts of decisions, the range of stakeholders might be somewhat smaller. If we're talking about, for example, citing a hazardous waste site, stakeholders might be everybody that lives in that local area that could potentially be affected by, leakage of pollutants out of the waste site. It would also include the people whose waste is being disposed of. It would include, local businesses that might be affected by whether that waste site gets built or not. It might include people who are advocates on behalf of the natural environment that might be affected. Right? All of these different sorts of people would be stakeholders that have a stake in that decision because they stand to be affected by it. And so we can define stakeholders sometimes by the sort of interest group, right? In what way would you be affected by the outcome of the decision? And that's kind of what I was doing when I was listing off those examples earlier, right? All those groups are people that are affected in different ways by the decision of how and where to build this waste site. You can also define different stakeholders by their point of view. People with different opinions about what should be done constitute different sorts of stakeholders. So participation means involvement by stakeholders in that decision making. So the more involvement that those stakeholders have and the wider variety of stakeholders that have some sort of involvement, the more participatory your decision making process is. So what I've got here is a classic illustration of public participation in decision making that comes from a researcher named Sherry Arnstein, and she conceptualized these different sorts of participation that might occur on a ladder, where higher rungs of the ladder involve greater degrees of participation. So at the bottom, she's got forms of what she calls non-participation. So ways that people can be involved that don't really count as real participation. So that lowest rung is manipulation. If the people making the decision manipulate the other stakeholders into going along with it, that's not real participation. Second rung is therapy, where you help people come to terms with the fact that you've made a decision that they may or may not like. Again, that's not really participation. Then the middle set she calls tokenism, where you have some sort of involvement, but it doesn't have any real teeth to it. So the third rung is just informing people of what the decision is going to be, keeping them up to date, giving them information about what's happening, so that they maybe can make their own decisions about, whether to go near this facility that's being built or something like that. Then you get to rung 4, you've got consultation, where you ask people for their opinions and maybe gather some information from them, get a little feedback, but they have no real control. They can't alter the decision, they can just tell you what they think about it. Go up another step, rung 5 is placation, where the decision maker may make some changes to the decision, may adjust how it's done in order to make those other stakeholders happy. Make some concessions to them so that they calm down and stop getting mad at you for what you're doing. Then those top 3 rungs are seen called forms of citizen power, where the stakeholders have some real control over the decision that gets made. So rung 6 is a partnership, where the decision makers and the other stakeholders work together. Rung 7 is delegated power, where the decision maker tells these other stakeholders, look, I will go with whatever decision you make. So you get together, you make a decision, you figure out what we should do, and I promise to go along with that. And then the top rung, the greatest degree of participation in Arnstein's scheme here, is citizen control, where the stakeholders have full control over the whole process and the decision being made. So you can see we have different levels of participation that might occur in any particular decision. And the argument that's often made is that the higher on that ladder you go, the better. And the more participation by more stakeholders is more just. And there are several different benefits that are often cited for participation, reasons that greater participation is more just. So one of those benefits is information. So these other stakeholders may bring additional information to the table about this issue. They may bring up facts that other decision makers hadn't been aware of. So an example of this comes from some research that I did on a Superfund site cleanup in Toms River, New Jersey. And so the EPA went in, they were going to clean up this site, and they had gotten all kinds of records from the Ciba-Geigy Corporation, which is the company that had caused the pollution of this site with their plant that had been located there. So they had all these records from the company about what kind of chemicals they were making there and how they had disposed of them. So this was going to be their kind of guide for what they needed to do to clean up this site. But they also tried to involve the public in it. They held hearings and so forth to get input from the community and work with community members to find a form of cleanup that people were going to be happy with. And they discovered in the process of doing this, among those local stakeholders that showed up to some of these meetings were people that had worked for this plant in the past. And some of them said, hey, when I was working at that plant, my supervisor told me to take these drums of toxic chemicals, go out in the woods behind the plant and bury them back there. And they never put that on the records. This was all under the table kind of stuff. But I can show you where those drums got buried. I remember where I took them out and buried them. So this was something the EPA wouldn't have known about from the company's own records. Right? The company didn't keep track of that because it was an illegal dumping that they were doing. But by involving the community, the EPA found out about this because these former workers were willing to come forward and say, hey, I know where this stuff was illegally dumped. And so if they hadn't found that out, they wouldn't have been able to do as thorough a cleanup of the site. So participation can be good for providing more information and therefore making the ultimate decision a better decision. You got a better cleanup by knowing this additional information. Participation can also improve compliance. So if stakeholders are involved in making a decision, they're more likely to go along with that decision. So you often need the compliance of various stakeholders in the implementation of the decision that gets made. You need them to go along with it. You need them to do their part. You need them to not decide they're going to take you to court over it. And so you can have better compliance with a decision if stakeholders are involved. That's partly because they're more likely to get a decision that they're happy with, and they're more likely to get concessions made or a compromise that addresses that particular stakeholder's concerns. But even if they don't, even if it's still a decision that a certain stakeholder is unhappy with, often feeling like the process has been just, right? Feeling like there's been procedural justice will make people willing to go along with the decision, even if it's not the decision that they would have chosen on their own, even if it's not what they advocated for. They feel like the decision-making process was just, so they will accept the outcome and comply with it regardless. So participation can improve compliance. And participation can be good in terms of democracy. So your theory of justice may hold that stakeholders have a right to be involved in decisions that affect them. So even if the best decision was made by some sort of authority figure, you may say that justice requires that people still ought to get the chance to be involved, that there's something inherently beneficial to people about being able to be involved in decisions that affect them, regardless of whether that actually changes the outcome of that decision. So these are some of the benefits of having a more participatory decision-making process. But there are also some potential drawbacks to having greater participation. So the most obvious one is that greater participation can be more costly in both money and time. So it makes the decision process take longer. It can involve a lot of resources being put into the decision that wouldn't have been needed if some sort of authority figure just went ahead and made that decision for everyone. Participation can also degenerate into conflict. If you get all these stakeholders together and people aren't willing to work with each other, aren't willing to give each other the benefit of the doubt, are bringing up old grudges that they have, you can get a very dysfunctional situation that maybe never results in any sort of decision being made. Having a blanket openness to participation, just getting as many stakeholders in as possible, can also end up elevating the wrong voices. It can give too much power to people who shouldn't have that power and can take away power from people who ought to have more of it. So a small minority point of view, you can have just a few people with a very different viewpoint than everybody else, may have their viewpoint kind of inflated by being given equal billing to a viewpoint that's held by the vast majority of people there. And so it creates this false equality between these different viewpoints. Another situation where this kind of thing can arise is with indigenous groups. There are a lot of situations in which indigenous nations have refused to participate in a participatory kind of process because they argued that they don't want to be just one among many stakeholders. They don't want a situation where, okay, well, we've gotten together the indigenous representative and the environmental group representative and the timber company representative, and now the three of you hash out a compromise between you. Because that indigenous nation may have rights to that land, rights to the resources there that are enshrined in a treaty and ought to take precedence over whatever any other non-indigenous stakeholders want out of that situation. And so by joining this participatory process, they effectively waive those treaty rights and end up getting treated as just another interest group, just another stakeholder among many, rather than a group with a particular relationship to the place in the decision and a special set of rights that they control. Sometimes you can have participation that is low on the rungs of that ladder and is just kind of lip service, and that may be worse than just not doing participation at all. Sometimes it pays to just be honest and say this is a non-participatory decision, sorry, you don't get any input, rather than giving lip service to having a participatory process that isn't really participatory. And finally, agreeing to join into some sort of a participatory process creates the risk of selling out. That by joining this process, by agreeing to abide by the decision that gets made, it involves giving up the right to object to the decision, to protest against it, to demand what you think is the best outcome. And so a lot of times activist groups of various sorts will decline to get involved in a participatory process because they don't want to feel like they might sell out. They don't want to feel like they're giving up their right to take a stand and be uncompromising in the position that they hold, and to give up using other tactics such as, protests and obstruction of activities and lawsuits and all these kind of things. You often give up morally, if not legally, the ability to do those things if you agree to join into a official participatory process for decision making. So we've been talking about participatory processes in these kind of vague terms. I think it's helpful to talk about some of the specific forms that this participation might take. If there's a decision to be made related to the environment, how might participation occur? How might these stakeholders get involved in the decision? One of the most common ways is a public hearing. And so the picture on the very first slide of this lesson was a picture from a public hearing. So the decision makers will have a time at which everybody can come and they can say their piece about what they think. And those public hearings can sometimes go on a very long time. If there's a lot of people and they all want to get their 2 minutes at the microphone or whatever, they're allotted. So public hearings are extremely common. They also tend to be fairly low on that ladder of participation. They don't allow a lot of direct involvement by those other stakeholders. You can also do a poll. So rather than having people have to come out to a hearing and show up at a meeting at a certain time, you can do a poll. You can call everybody at home or send them a questionnaire in the mail and gather people's input and opinions in that way. That, again, doesn't generally give a lot of control by the stakeholders who are responding to the poll, but it's a way of gathering their input and information. You can make a poll binding, in which case it becomes a referendum, where the outcome of that poll determines what the actual decision being made is. So that creates more control of the outcome on the part of those stakeholders that participate in the referendum. You can also create a community advisory group. So here you get together representatives from the key groups of stakeholders, and they meet to hash things out among themselves, to learn about the issue, to debate possible outcomes, and to help shape the decision that gets made. You can have a workshop that's open to the public where people come and you often divide people up into groups, give them information about the decision that needs to be made, and have them work together to come up with possible solutions. And related to that, you can have a deliberative forum. And the key distinction of a deliberative forum over something like a public hearing is that the goal is for people not just to express their opinions and maybe shout at each other and try to browbeat or shame people into changing what they're doing, but that people are supposed to be sharing their reasons for things and learning to understand each other, and through that process coming to some sort of a consensus or agreement about the right way to go. Okay, so the last thing that I want to talk about related to procedural justice is the question of intent. So a lot of times we'll look at an outcome that seems unjust, but then the question gets raised of whether that was an intentional outcome. Did the people that made that decision intend for this injustice to occur? So, we can all pretty much agree that intentionally choosing an unjust outcome is clearly wrong. So if you are intentionally choosing to do something unjust, if you are intentionally choosing to discriminate, for example, that's wrong. You shouldn't do it. And that doesn't in any way call into question the injustice of the outcome. You also have situations where the decision is negligent. So the person didn't intentionally bring about an injustice, but they should have known that the decision they were making would create these kinds of problems. You have a certain responsibility to evaluate the decisions that you're making, to recognize certain potential issues that your decision might raise, and to incorporate that into your decision. So negligence is when you don't exercise that kind of care. You aren't intentionally doing something wrong, but you ought to have known that the thing that you're doing was wrong. You should have looked more carefully and realized that there was this problem. But then you can also have outcomes that have unjust effects, even if they're chosen for genuinely innocent reasons. So the reasons behind making a certain choice seem to be totally innocent, and yet the outcome is one that seems to be unjust. And so this is the case where we may be looking at policies that have disparate impacts. And so this goes back to that question the Supreme Court was evaluating in the Alexander v. Sandoval case of whether disparate impact is enough to demonstrate the existence of injustice for the purposes of Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So in this one narrow legal context, whether disparate impact was enough. Here we're thinking more broadly about justice in general. All right, so disparate impact is when a policy harms one group more than it harms another. And so disparate impact can exist even without any intent to target a certain group for harm. You may not be intending to harm a certain group, but the decision made might still do that in practice, and then you have a situation of disparate impact. It's also the case that making apparently neutral choices in a context of ongoing injustice. So when the background situation you're operating in is one in which significant injustices exist, then making a seemingly neutral choice can create unjust outcomes because of how it interacts with this background situation of injustice. We have to remember that we can't assume that we can only just look at this one decision and assume that the rest of everything else going on around us is just, so we're only evaluating the outcomes of this one decision. We're often making decisions about justice and injustice in a context in which there's widespread injustice within the society. So as an example, to try to make this a little more concrete, imagine that a decision is being made about some environmental issue, like say about whether to allow mining to occur in a certain location. And the people in charge of that decision, the EPA or whoever, says that they will accept all comments from the public and from other stakeholders by email. Now, that's a seemingly neutral choice, right? Email is, just a neutral choice of format for sending in these comments. But if you are making that choice to only accept comments by email in a situation in which you have this background injustice, that means that certain groups of people are unlikely to have access to email. And there are certain groups in your society that, due to poverty and discrimination, are unlikely to have reliable access to the internet, to have created email accounts that they could use to submit these comments. Then this seemingly neutral rule that you're going to take your comments by email can create an injustice of cutting some people out of the decision-making process, depriving them of participation, because of how it interacts with this background situation of injustice in which certain people don't have access to email and the internet. And then the last thing to keep in mind is that when we talk about the role of intent and we talk about disparate impacts, that evaluating the outcome can be distinct from deciding whether to blame the decision maker. So we often think, well, if the outcome is unjust, that means the decision maker is a bad person, wag our finger at them, or send them to jail or whatever. But those are not necessarily always going together. You can have a situation in which the decision maker might be blameless or have reduced blame against them, saying that they're a bad person, did bad stuff, even while the outcome of the situation is judged to be unjust and ought to be changed. So we want to make sure that we see the conceptual distinction between evaluating the justice of the outcome and blaming the decision maker. So that brings us to the end of this lesson, and I will see you next time.